Before we read about Ruth, I want to take time to talk about Judges and to run to the events that happens in the book of Judges, because Judges sets up Ruth. And we would be remiss if we didn't talk about Judges a little bit in this worship service. By the way, my hope with these summaries is that if you're reading along with us, you're like, oh, this is a good overview. And my hope, if you're not reading along with us, is that you'll go, oh, I should go home and read Judges. There's no Sunday football. You've got time, right? It's a very exciting book. So Judges starts with a failure, acknowledgement of a failure to do all things that they said they did in Joshua. The land is not conquered. They are still living with foreigners in their midst. And there's a story of Caleb giving land to his daughter, right? Giving extra land to his daughter. Joshua dies. And then we read that the Israelites are unfaithful, and the Israelites do what is evil in the eyes of God, and Othniel rises up to bring them back to faithfulness and serves as a hero before they experience a downfall because of their unfaithfulness. And then Othniel dies, and we're told that Israel jumps straight to doing evil again. And it's the Moabites that are allowed to conquer and oppress them. And we're told that the Moabites are run by King Elgon. And the thing we learn about King Elgon is that he's very fat. He's a large dude. And Ehud rises up and defeats King Elgon by literally burying a cubit-long sword into his fat and escaping. And then we're told there's 80 years of rest. And then we're told about another hero, Shamgar, who kills Philistines. Then the story again says that the Israelites begin doing evil, and now it's the Canaanites that rise up to oppress them. And we get the story of the prophetess Deborah, the hero general Barak, and the very clever Jael with her milk bowl and her kind words and her tent peg and her hammer. Then the Israelites do evil, and now it's the Midianites who come to oppress them. And we're told that the Midianites are numberless. They are beyond count. And we get the hero Gideon, who gives God these weird tests to make sure he's actually called to do this work. And he defeats the Midianites with 300 men and trumpets and jars and torches. But then Gideon makes a golden ephod, and the people worship that. And somehow God allows this. And then we're told again that the people begin to do evil. Abimelech, Gideon's son, by a secondary wife or a concubine or a prostitute, whatever your Bible says, that word kind of means all of those things. Abimelech kills his brothers and engages in a military conquest and rules for 30 years, but he's killed by an unnamed woman dropping a millstone on his head from the top of a tower, and then his servant runs him through so that no one could say a woman killed him, but obviously this story is recorded, so we know how it went down. And then Tola judges Israel, and then Jair judges Israel, leads Israel. And then we're told that Israel again does what is evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Ammonites are allowed to oppress them this time. And we learn about Jephthah. Jephthah is raised up to win military victories, but before one of his military victories, he makes a rash vow to God about killing the first thing that comes to greet him when he comes home. And it's kind of a weird vow, because there's nothing that's going to run out to greet him that would be a proper sacrifice to God. Right? I mean, we're talking God likes cows and goats and doves. But odds are Jephthah's probably thinking like, the dog? I mean, I don't know who else would run out to greet him. And what ends up happening is that it's his daughter who comes to greet him. And Jephthah keeps his vow. His daughter is killed. And we learn of a ritual where there are 4 days a year that the women of Israel go out every single year to mourn for Jephthah's daughter. And I've heard that in some synagogues, this is still a practice to this day. Then the judges Ibzan, and then Elon and Abdon judge Israel in succession. And then we're told again that the Israelites do what is evil in the eyes of the Lord, and it is the Philistines this time who rise up to oppress them. And we get the Samson story. Samson with his Nazirite vows of not shaving his head or cutting his hair or eating or drinking anything that comes from a wine. Samson with his stories of like killing a lion, and then there's honey in a lion, and he eats the lion, and he kills people with donkey jawbones, and there's a prostitute named Delilah, and there's eye gouging, and there's the tearing out of buildings. See, don't you want to go read Judges if you haven't already? And then after Samson's time, the tribe of Ephraim establishes its own worship center, complete with a Levitical priest. And then the tribe of Dan takes the worship center away and establishes it somewhere else. And we're given this interesting sentence of, and as long as there was a worship temple in Shiloh, there was also this worship temple in the tribe of Dan. And then we get this really graphic story, trigger warning, about a Levite who goes to reclaim his secondary wife or his concubine. And it sounds at first like marital drama and kind of trouble with the in-laws, and who can't relate to that? And then they're driving home, or driving. Yeah, wow. They're on a donkey going home. I suppose you could call it driving back then. They're on a donkey going home, and they stop in a Benjamite town. This is an Israelite town. They stop in an Israelite town, and the Benjamites act like the people of Sodom and Gomorrah acted. They demanded to rape the man, and the women are sent out instead. The unnamed concubine is sent out, and she is raped, and then ordered to get up the next day, and then carried home, and then chopped into 12 pieces by her husband. And then war begins against the Benjamites. And then if that wasn't weird enough, after most of the tribe of Benjamin has been killed off, 300 men survive, but they're going to die because there's no women for them. And so then we get these weird stories about another Israelite town. All their men are killed off so their virgins can marry the Benjamites. And then the Benjamites are allowed to kidnap women coming home from this festival so that the tribe doesn't die off and the rest of the Israelites don't break their vow to give them their daughters and wives. But if you take them, surely that's not the same thing. And then the book of Judges literally ends with this verse. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So if we stop at the end of the book of Judges, one of the things that we might conclude is that people are really awful, right? At least that's the impression that I get when I read the book of Judges. And man, isn't that an impression that's easy to get even to this day? People are awful. The things people say to each other, the way nations treat the resources of other nations, we throw people away as if they're nothing because they're in our way, they're objects to be used. People can be really awful. It's just so easy to think that. Please, I see some of you nodding, but I know I'm going to assume most of you have had that thought. Like you open up the newspaper or your social media and you're like, ugh. Gross. And then we come to the book of Ruth. And I want to read our passage now. I want you to hear these words from the book of Ruth. Then Naomi arose along with her daughters-in-law to return from the field of Moab, because while in the territory of Moab, she had heard that the Lord had paid attention to his people by providing food for them. She left the place where she had been, and her 2 daughters-in-law went with her. They went along the road to return to the land of Judah. Naomi said to her daughters-in-law, "Go, turn back each of you to the household of your mother. May the Lord deal faithfully with you just as you have done with the dead and with me. May the Lord provide for you so that you may find security, each woman in the household of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. But they replied to her, "No, instead we will return with you to your people." Naomi replied, "Turn back, my daughters. Why would you go with me? Will there again be sons in my womb that they would be husbands for you? Turn back, my daughters, go. I am too old for a husband. If I were to say that I have hope, even if I had a husband tonight, and even more if I were to bear sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you refrain from having a husband? No, my daughters, this is more bitter for me than for you, since the Lord's will has come out against me. Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth stayed with her. Naomi said, look, your sister-in-law is returning to her people and to her gods. Turn back after your sister-in-law. But Ruth replied, don't urge me to abandon you, to turn back from following after you. Wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do this to me, and more so if even death separates me from you. When Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped speaking to her about it. So both of them went along until they arrived at Bethlehem. When they arrived at Bethlehem, the whole town was excited on account of them, and the women of the town asked, can this be Naomi? She replied to them, don't call me Naomi, but call me Mara, for the Almighty has made me very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has returned me empty. Why would you call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has deemed me guilty? Thus Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, returned with her from the territory of Moab. They arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. Here ends the reading. Spirit of God, stir up your people. Thanks be to God. So hereafter, a long account of how awful people can be and how much the land of Israel is tearing itself apart, both from the outside and the inside. We have a very specific story about a family, and it's not that long of a book. The story narrows all the way down to a couple of people, to Naomi and her husband, who have fled from a famine into the land of Moab, where her sons get married, and then there's something that happens where Naomi's husband and sons are killed, and that's where we get the scene that we have today. Ruth and Orpah are encouraged to go back to their father's and their mother's household because there's no sons to give them in levirate marriage. The name of Naomi's husband, his lineage is done. All the men of his family have died. And there are no children, there are no grandchildren coming. But Ruth gives one of the most beautiful statements in Scripture. I will go with you. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. I will die and be buried where you die and are buried. It is gorgeous. And the two women go back to Bethlehem, and they live with Naomi's family. And throughout the book, we find out that they do what happens to widows. They live off the gleanings of their relatives' land. So imagine this, if you've ever farmed. Back then, farming and harvesting was done more by hand, and obviously you weren't getting everything from the field. You were supposed to leave stuff behind, and someone like Ruth, who was young and strong, could come along with a basket, and she could take the things that the original harvesters missed. And she's allowed to do this. And Boaz sees her doing this, and Boaz says, don't just take the gleaning, come to my threshing floor. You can take all that you want, not just what you can carry, but take more than that. Boaz is beyond generous with Ruth. And Ruth goes back and tells Naomi or Mara about this generosity of Boaz. And then there's a scene which reads a little confusing in the English, but it's a seduction scene on the threshing floor after Boaz has been celebrating the harvest. And after this scene, Boaz says, let's get married, because Boaz is a good dude. And that's what happens. And there's a whole can I redeem you? If I marry Ruth, I inherit Naomi's husband's land. Are we all okay with that? And there's some exchanges, but ultimately it all works out. And Ruth and Boaz get married. And then we hear about the genealogy that leads us all the way to King David. By the way, this genealogy means it will also lead us all the way to Jesus. So Ruth, the Moabite, who was one of those people that we were supposed to kill off when we conquered the land, who was one of those people that was in the story of oppressing us in the book of Judges. Ruth the Moabite saves her Israelite mother-in-law and participates in this beautiful story of generosity and kindness after all of this grossness of the book of Judges. There is power. There is tremendous, overwhelming power in acts of loyalty between people. There is tremendous, overwhelming power in an act that says, I will walk with you in this. Notice that Ruth and Naomi don't try to save each other. They can't. They don't have any resources back then. All they can do is say, we are in this together. We will do this thing together. And there's conversations and negotiations, and Naomi helps Ruth figure out how to interact with Boaz and what the rules and expectations are for her in the book of Israel. And in return, when Ruth and Boaz get married and Ruth has a baby, Naomi receives consolation and hope from the fact that not everything is awful as it appeared. There is now life in Naomi's life again. All because they decided to walk with each other. This is such an important distinction and a thing that I want us to cling to deeply because, like I said, it is so easy to open up our social media and our news stories and to be like, wow, people are awful. Things are awful. We are a world at war right now. And that doesn't even count all of the selfish acts that we read about constantly in the news, because the news really likes to report the bad stuff. In the midst of all the bad stuff, the solution to it, in my mind, or the antidote, the counter argument, the hope, whatever you want to talk about, is these stories of loyalty with one another, of walking with. In her book, Atlas of the Heart, Brene Brown, if you're a reader, by the way, I cannot recommend it. If you like feelings at all, or if you ever feel feelings, you need to read this book. In her book, Brene Brown outlines the difference between empathy, compassion, sympathy, and pity. And in her book, sympathy and pity are bad things. Because in sympathy, what we do is we try to say, oh, I feel sorry for you, or I try to feel feelings for you, or I try to take over the situation and make it about me, or at worst, I also try to distance you. If I feel sorry for you, if I feel pity for you, that automatically puts a value judgment between you and me. I have set myself up as someone who can feel sorry for you. I am better than you. There is space between us, but empathy and compassion is a walking with. She defines it this way. Empathy, the most powerful tool of compassion, is an emotional skill set that allows us to understand what someone is experiencing and to reflect back that understanding. Compassion is the daily practice of recognizing and accepting our shared humanity, so that we treat ourselves and others with loving kindness, and we take action in the face of suffering. So maybe we're so lucky that we've never lived in a combat zone. But maybe, just maybe, we can relate to what it feels like to lose everything, or to feel unsafe in a moment. And if we can acknowledge and hear and believe what somebody is saying, that they feel unsafe in a moment, if we can access that feeling, then we can come alongside them and help to change that circumstance. Or in a little bit, we're going to be commissioning our care team. And one of the things that our care team does is they go and they visit people, right? They go and they sit with people. And it's not like they come in, none of us can solve all the problems, right? But we can come alongside and say, I know what it feels like to feel loneliness. And I can't take your loneliness or your fear or the unknown away, but I can sit with you in that. I can be here with you in that, and I can believe you when you tell me how you're feeling, and I can walk alongside you. Naomi and Ruth are so loyal to each other because Ruth has no idea. She's never lost a child. But she did lose a husband, and so she knows what it means to experience loss. And she lost maybe the sense of potential future children, right? And so in that shared loss, they walk alongside each other. And when they meet Boaz, and Boaz sees them as two women living alone, he's obviously never been a woman living alone. He doesn't know, he can't feel their feelings for them or make this story about them, but maybe Boaz knows what it means to wonder where his next meal is going to come from. And so he can walk alongside them and show Ruth, if you harvest over here, there's more grain. When we come alongside people and hear their stories and believe their stories and think about our own stories and think about our own feelings, not, again, to take over the narrative, but to access how that feeling might feel and walk with. That is the antidote. I really believe this. This is the antidote to, oh my gosh, people are awful. Because then we can say to ourselves, actually, people are wonderful. They can be wonderful, right? People can be awful, but people can also be wonderful. They can be loyal. They can be kind. They can be generous. They can tell funny stories. There's beauty in the midst of this interaction. And I think that is why Ruth is put right there in between Judges and Kings. That in the midst of all this national posturing where the people in power are doing horrible things, there is still stories of faithfulness and obedience and beauty. And how wonderful and how reassuring and how comforting it is that this is the line that David and Jesus come from. So today for us, even if it's tempting in the moment to think everything is awful and everyone is fighting and people are just kind of horrible, the call is not to shut down. The call is to walk alongside, to make those connections and to open ourselves up to empathy with one another, to look for people who are walking with us and to offer more care and more connections, and to respond with generosity to the needs that we see around us. Amen?